The transport shuddered on its final approach to Outpost Kestrel. A lonely steel tooth hammered into the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Arctic. Master Sergeant Anya Volkov felt the vibration not as a nuisance, but as a simple fact of travel, another piece of data to be filed away. She sat alone, her duffel bag at her feet, her hands resting motionless in her lap. The other passengers, a handful of rotating technicians and a junior officer fresh from indoctrination, had given up trying to engage her in conversation hours ago. Her silence was a wall, smooth and impenetrable. They saw a woman nearing 40, with strands of gray threading through her tightly bound dark hair and eyes the color of a winter sky that offered no warmth. They saw her rank, but her file read administrative transfer, a quiet damnation in the military world. It meant she was being put out to pasture. They mocked her silence with whispers and sideways glances, assuming it was the quiet of someone who had nothing important to say. They didn't see the way her gaze swept the cabin, noting the stress points in the fuselage, the wear on the emergency hatch release, the nervous tick of the young officer. They didn't notice that her stillness was not passive, but a state of absolute readiness. When the ramp lowered with a hydraulic hiss, the wind screamed in, a physical assault of cold and ice. The others flinched, pulling their collars tighter. Anya simply rose, her movements economical and fluid, and walked into the storm as if it were a mild breeze. The base was a collection of interconnected, semi-subterranean modules, designed to withstand anything the planet could throw at it. Its purpose was singular: to listen. It was the ear of the Northern Hemisphere, its arrays and servers processing a torrent of global data. A young corporal, his face red from the cold, met her at the entrance. "Master Sergeant Volkov?" He checked a datapad. "Right. Quartermaster is that way for your bunk assignment. Report to the CO, Colonel Madsen, at 0800 tomorrow." He gestured vaguely down a sterile gray corridor and turned his attention to the more important task of unloading supplies. He didn't offer to help with her bag. He didn't need to. Anya hefted the duffel onto her shoulder with an ease that belied its weight and started walking. Her boots made no sound on the grated floor. She was a ghost arriving in a place already haunted by isolation. The few soldiers she passed in the corridor barely registered her, another cog being slotted into the machine. But one, a grizzled sergeant first class named Reyes, watched her go. He saw not a paper pusher, but a discipline in her posture, a coiled tension in her silence that reminded him of the predators he'd once tracked in a different kind of frozen wasteland. He saw a woman who knew precisely how to move through the world without making a ripple, and he knew that was a skill learned not behind a desk, but in places where a single misplaced step could be your last. The next morning, Anya stood before Colonel Madsen's desk at precisely 0800. The office was a monument to military rigidity. Flags stood in perfect formation, awards were aligned with geometric precision, and the man himself seemed cast from the same mold. Colonel Madsen was sharp, lean, and radiated an impatience that bordered on contempt for anything that disrupted his meticulously ordered world. He glanced at her file on his screen, then at her, his eyes lingering for a moment on the administrative transfer designation. Confirmed all his assumptions. "Master Sergeant Volkov," he said, his voice clipped. "Welcome to Outpost Kestrel. Your file is brief," the word hung in the air, an accusation of an unremarkable career. "It says here you have a background in signals analysis." Clerical, I assume. He didn't wait for an answer. "This is a high-tempo operational environment. We are the tip of the spear in intelligence gathering. We do not have time for deadweight or personnel requiring acclimation." Anya's expression remained neutral. Her gaze was fixed on a point just over his shoulder. "I understand, sir." Her voice was low, steady, devoid of inflection. It was the voice of someone who had used it to convey life or death information, not to engage in pleasantries. The lack of deference of any attempt to impress him seemed to irritate Madsen further. He saw it as insolence or worse, incompetence cloaked in silence. "Your duties will be straightforward," he continued, a condescending edge to his tone. "You will be assigned to the comms hub. Your primary responsibility will be system inventory and diagnostic logging. Corporal Davies is the shift lead. He will show you the ropes. You will log everything, touch nothing, and report any anomalies through the proper channels. Is that clear? The assignment was a deliberate insult. Diagnostic logging was a task for a private fresh out of training, a way to keep someone busy and out of the way. He was placing her in the nerve center of his base but giving her the most menial job within it. He wanted her to feel her irrelevance. "Crystal, sir," Anya replied. The single word, delivered with the same flat calm, was a pebble dropped into the pond of his authority. It made no splash, but the ripples were there. Madsen narrowed his eyes. He was used to soldiers who were either eager to please or cowed by his rank. This woman was neither. She was simply present. A block of granite in his perfectly manicured office. This is not some rear echelon posting where you can count down the days to retirement, Sergeant, he warned. Every person here has a critical function. See that you perform yours, he gestured dismissively towards the door. That will be all. Anya executed a precise about-face and walked out of the office. She closed the door behind her with a soft click, leaving the colonel stewing in a pool of his own certainty. He had assessed her, categorized her, and dismissed her. In his mind, she was a problem already solved. A piece of administrative clutter filed away in the quietest, most useless corner of his command. He had no idea he had just placed a master locksmith inside the vault and handed her a job that required her to study the keyhole all day long. The comms hub of Outpost Kestrel was a cavern of quiet hums and blinking lights. Banks of servers lined the walls, their cooling fans a constant, low roar like a distant waterfall. Technicians moved with practiced efficiency between terminals, their faces illuminated by the glow of cascading data. It was the heart of the base, pumping information in and out in a ceaseless rhythm. Corporal Davies, a young man with a brilliant mind for coding and a nervous energy that kept him in constant motion, greeted Anya with a distracted wave. "Master Sergeant, Colonel said you'd be down, right? Logging. It's easy." He pointed to a terminal tucked away in a corner, far from the main operations floor. "That's your station. The system spits out diagnostic reports every 5 minutes. You just collate them, check for red flags, and file them in the shared drive. Any actual red flags, you tell me, and I'll tell the lieutenant. Don't touch anything else." He rattled off the instructions, his attention already back on a complex algorithm displayed on his own screen. Anya took her seat. The terminal was old, the keyboard worn smooth. For the first hour, she did exactly as she was told. She opened the diagnostic logs, collated the data, and filed the reports. The work was tedious, mind-numbing, and she performed it with a placid focus that the other technicians mistook for dull-witted compliance. They whispered among themselves the same mockery from the transport resurfacing. "Look at her. Bet she was a world-class coffee maker back at command." Madsen's finally found a place to hide the fossils. Anya heard them. She always heard everything. But their words were just noise, irrelevant data streams to be filtered out. Her real work had already begun. While her hands performed the mechanical task of logging, her mind was mapping the entire system. Her eyes weren't on the simple reports in front of her, but on the network architecture diagrams faintly visible on a large monitor across the room. She was tracing the flow of data, noting the server designations, the firewall protocols, the encryption layers. It was familiar, unnervingly so. The core architecture, the deep-level programming that formed the station's digital skeleton, was a ghost from her past. It was based on a security protocol she had helped design over a decade ago. A project so classified its name had been wiped from most official records. Project Chimera. It was meant to be unbreakable, a labyrinth of digital traps and dead ends. But she knew its secrets. She knew the ghost doors she and her team had built into its foundation, the emergency backdoors that no official schematic would ever show. She saw the upgrades and patches that had been layered on top of her original work, like new paint on an old war machine. Some were elegant, others were clumsy, creating unforeseen vulnerabilities. She watched Davies work, his fingers flying across his keyboard. He was fast, brilliant even, but he was also reckless. He ran command line scripts with elevated privileges for routine tasks, left diagnostic ports open longer than necessary, and prioritized speed over security. He was a talented musician playing a complex instrument without understanding how it was built. Anya continued her quiet work, her face a mask of placid concentration. Every 5 minutes, a new log appeared. Every 5 minutes, she filed it away. And with every passing minute, she built a complete, three-dimensional map of the base's digital soul in her mind. She saw its strengths, its weaknesses, its pressure points. She was no longer just a clerk. She was an observer, a silent auditor waiting for the first crack to appear in the foundation. The first sign of trouble was subtle. A flicker of the overhead lights so brief most didn't even notice. Anya did. Her head came up, her fingers pausing over the keyboard. She saw a microsecond of lag on the main dataflow monitor, a tiny hiccup in the river of information. Davies swore under his breath, typing furiously. Just a power fluctuation from the generators. He called out to the shift lieutenant, not entirely believing it himself. Then it happened again. This time, a bank of secondary monitors went dark for a full second before rebooting. A low, insistent alarm began to beep from a server rack in the corner. Panic, a cold and quiet predator, began to stalk the edges of the room. "What is it, Davies?" the lieutenant demanded, striding over to his station. "I don't know, sir," the corporal stammered, his usual confidence gone. "I'm seeing anomalous data packets in the geothermal regulation system. It's like the system is fighting itself. Commands are being entered and then immediately canceled." Colonel Madsen stormed into the comms hub, his face a thundercloud. "Report!" he barked, his voice cutting through the rising tension. "We have an unknown system error, sir," the lieutenant said, his voice tight. "We're trying to isolate it, but it's jumping between subsystems." The beeping from the server rack grew faster, more urgent. A red light began to flash. "That's the coolant control for the primary server core," Davies said, his voice barely a whisper. "If that goes down, the core will overheat and fry in under 3 minutes. We'll lose everything." The technicians swarmed the main console, their movements becoming frantic. They were throwing every diagnostic they had at the problem, but the system was actively resisting them, locking them out of the very controls they needed. Madsen stood behind them, his hands clenched into fists, a general helpless to fight an enemy he couldn't see. He shouted orders, but they were useless. "Reboot the coolant control. Manually override it. Get it back online now." Through it all, Anya remained at her station. She had not moved. Her chair was angled slightly, giving her a clear view of the entire room. She wasn't watching the screens anymore. She was watching the people. She saw their panic, their disorganized response, the way their training was failing them under real pressure. She saw the flaw in their approach. They were trying to solve a high-tech problem with high-tech tools, but the system itself had turned against them. Her gaze drifted from the panicked technicians to the flashing red light on the server rack, then to a small, unassuming maintenance panel on the wall beside it. The panel was labeled Manual Power Conduit E47. It was a piece of old, reliable analog technology in a room full of delicate digital systems. While the others fought a ghost in the machine, she was looking at the machine's physical body. Her breathing was slow and even. The rising cacophony of alarms and shouts was just another layer of data. She had processed the problem, identified the immediate threat, and located the most efficient solution. The time for observation was over. The alarm shrieked, a piercing, solid tone that signified critical failure. "Override is locked out," Davies yelled, his face pale. "Coolant pumps are offline. Core temperature is rising fast. We have 90 seconds until catastrophic failure." Madsen slammed his fist on a console. "Unacceptable," he roared, his authority utterly useless. The room was a whirlwind of controlled chaos, technicians shouting jargon at each other, the lieutenant relaying the failure up the chain of command. In the eye of the storm, Anya stood up. She moved with a silent, deliberate grace that was unnerving in its calm. No one noticed her at first, They were all transfixed by the digital apocalypse unfolding on the main screen. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't announce her intentions. She simply acted. She walked directly to the server rack with the flashing red light. Her path was a straight line, her focus absolute. She ignored the frantic technicians and the bellowing colonel. Reaching the wall beside the rack, she knelt in front of the small maintenance panel. It was secured with standard hex bolts. While others might have scrambled for a toolkit, Anya simply reached into a small pocket on her belt and produced a compact multi-tool, its steel worn from years of use. Her fingers, steady and sure, worked the tool, and in seconds the bolts were loosened. She set the panel cover carefully on the floor. Inside was a dense nest of armored cables and junction boxes. To the untrained eye, it was a meaningless tangle. To Anya, it was a schematic she had already memorized from a diagram she'd glanced at hours earlier. Her eyes scanned the conduits, identifying the primary power line to the coolant pumps and the redundant line that was currently offline. She saw the problem instantly. The digital switchover, controlled by the corrupted system, had failed, leaving the pumps in a state of limbo, receiving no power from either source. With a deft movement, she used the pliers on her multi-tool to sever the plastic tie-downs on two thick, insulated cables. She exposed a small length of wire on each. Then, she located a manual bus bar, a heavy strip of copper that bypassed the entire digital control system. It was a relic, a last-ditch physical override from an earlier design philosophy. It was also their salvation. She clamped one cable to the input terminal and the other to the output, her movements precise and efficient with no wasted motion. A shower of blue sparks erupted from the connection, and the acrid smell of ozone filled the air. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, with a deep, resonant thrum that vibrated through the floor, the coolant pumps kicked to life. The piercing alarm cut off abruptly. On the main screen, the core temperature reading, which had been climbing into the red, stabilized and began to drop. Silence descended on the comms hub. It was a profound, ringing silence, broken only by the hum of the newly activated pumps and the clicking of cooling servers. Every person in the room, technicians, the lieutenant, Colonel Madsen, was staring at the quiet woman kneeling by the open panel on the floor. She calmly secured the cables, replaced the panel cover, and tightened the bolts. She stood, wiped a smudge of grease from her hand with a rag from her pocket, and returned the multi-tool to her belt. Then, without a word, without a single glance at the stunned faces around her, she walked back to her forgotten corner terminal and sat down. She looked at her screen, where a new diagnostic log had just appeared, and with the same placid focus as before, she began to collate the data. She had intervened, solved a crisis that would have crippled the entire base, and then returned to her menial task as if nothing had happened. The act was so jarring in its understated competence that it left everyone speechless. Colonel Madsen was the first to break the spell. He walked over to her station, his footsteps unnaturally loud in the quiet room. He stood over her, a storm of conflicting emotions on his face. Shock, confusion, and a grudging, nascent respect. "Master Sergeant," he said, his voice low and tight, stripped of its earlier condescension. "Explain yourself. How did you know to do that?" Anya didn't look up from her screen immediately. She finished filing the report, her fingers tapping out the final keystrokes. Only then did she turn her head slightly to meet his gaze. Her eyes were calm, unreadable. "The architectural schematics are displayed on the main tactical screen, sir," she stated, her tone flat and factual. The digital relays were clearly compromised. The manual power bus was the only logical alternative. She made it sound simple, obvious. She didn't mention that it took a deep, intuitive understanding of power systems and a surgeon's comm under pressure to perform a live-wire bypass in under 30 seconds. She took no credit. She merely stated the facts. The explanation, so simple and direct, left Madsen with nothing to say. He had no grounds to reprimand her for acting without orders. She had saved millions of dollars in equipment and prevented a catastrophic intelligence blackout. He could only stand there, reassessing everything he thought he knew about the quiet woman he had dismissed as dead weight. He gave a curt nod. "Carry on," he mumbled and turned away. The mockery in the room had evaporated, replaced by a thick atmosphere of awe and curiosity. Corporal Davies approached her terminal, his earlier arrogance gone, replaced by a genuine, almost fearful respect. I've never seen anyone do a hot bypass on a Series 7 power junction," he said, his voice hushed. "I thought you needed to shut down the whole grid to even try." Anya glanced at him. "Not if you know which conduit carries the initiation charge," she said simply, and turned back to her work. The conversation, for her, concluded. Later, away from the comms hub, the whispers started again, but their content had changed entirely. It was no longer mockery, but speculation. "Did you see her hands? Not a tremor," one technician said to another. "Reyes was right," another admitted. "She's not a clerk." Sergeant Reyes, leaning against a bulkhead, just listened and nodded to himself. He'd seen operators like her before, ghosts who carried the weight of 100 secret battles in their silence. They didn't need to speak, because their actions spoke with the force of a thunderclap. In his office, Colonel Madsen pulled up Anya Volkov's file again. It was just as sparse as before. Administrative transfer, signals analysis, a handful of standard commendations. But now, the redactions, the large blocks of black ink hiding years of her service record, seemed less like signs of an unremarkable career and more like the bars of a cage holding back something powerful. Who was she? He sent a priority request to Central Command, using his own authorization codes. Request for unredacted service record of Master Sergeant Anya Volkov. Urgent, the mystery of the silent sergeant had become an operational priority. The temporary fix held, but the base was still wounded. The malevolent code, the ghost in the machine, had been thwarted in its attempt to physically destroy the servers, but it was still there, lurking deep within the system. It was smarter than any virus Davies had ever encountered. It learned, it adapted, and it was now methodically working to sever the outpost's connection to the outside world. The main satellite uplink began to degrade, the data stream becoming corrupt and intermittent. They were slowly being isolated, turned into a digital island. Worse, the entity in their system began a new, more terrifying assault. It started probing the base's automated defense systems. Outpost Kestrel wasn't just a listening post. It was a fortress. It had a network of automated sentry guns for perimeter defense and, deep in a silo buried under the ice, a battery of surface-to-air missiles. An error message flashed on the tactical screen. Defense grid unauthorized access attempt. Panic returned to the comms hub, colder and sharper this time. This wasn't about losing data. This was about losing their lives. If the attacker gained control of the defense grid, they could use the base's own weapons against it. Madsen, flanked by his senior officers, directed a desperate digital counterattack. They built firewalls, but the code flowed around them. They tried to scrub the infected systems, but the code had rooted itself too deeply, entwining itself with the core operating system. They were losing. Every door they tried to close, the entity had already opened another. The access attempts on the defense grid became more persistent, more aggressive. A countdown timer appeared on the screen, originating from the malicious code itself. Weapons release and 10 o'clock minutes. It was a taunt, a declaration of victory. "It's a bluff," the lieutenant said, his voice lacking conviction. "It can't seize launch authority without authorization from Central Command." Davies, his face ashen, shook his head. "Sir, it's not trying to get external authorization. It's activating the local failsafe release. It's a protocol for scenarios where the base is about to be overrun. It's turning the base into a self-destructing fortress." Madsen stared at the countdown. 9 minutes and ticking down. His command, his career, his life, and the lives of everyone on the base were slipping through his fingers. He had thrown all his best people at the problem, and they had failed. His eyes scanned the room. A desperate search for an answer. A miracle. His gaze fell on Master Sergeant Volkov. She was standing now, not at her terminal, but before the main tactical screen, her arms crossed, her expression one of intense, analytical concentration. She was not watching the countdown. She was reading the raw code scrolling past on a diagnostic subscreen, her eyes moving with impossible speed. She was the only person in the room who wasn't panicking. In that moment of absolute crisis, Madsen's rigid adherence to protocol shattered. He had no other options. He walked over to her, his voice devoid of all previous arrogance. "Sergeant," he said, the word a plea. "You have insight into this system. What do we do?" Anya didn't look at him. Her focus remained locked on the screen. "The malicious code is a derivative of an old hunter-killer program," she said, her voice calm and level, cutting through the tense atmosphere like a scalpel. "Project Cerberus. It doesn't just infect a system. It bonds with it. You can't scrub it without destroying the host. So what's the answer?" Madsen pressed, the countdown clock now showing 7 minutes. "You can't fight it from inside the system," Anya explained. "It controls the battlefield. Trying to do so is like trying to put out a fire with gasoline. The only way is to trigger a hard reset. A full system purge and reboot from the isolated firmware kernel." Davies overheard and shook his head. "The Zero Protocol. Sir, that's a theoretical failsafe. It requires a level Omega authorization code. It's a code so secret, most people don't think it even exists. The system won't accept any of our command-level credentials." The countdown hit 6 minutes. The lights in the room flickered ominously. A new message appeared on the screen. "Perimeter turrets, targeting acquired." The hum of machinery from outside the comms hub changed. A low, menacing whine as the automated guns began to swivel, turning their barrels inward, towards the heart of the base. The countdown timer dipped below 3 minutes. The perimeter turrets had locked onto the base's central habitat module. The missile silo doors were cycling through their pre-launch sequence. The comms hub had become a tomb counting down its own destruction. The technicians had backed away from their consoles, their faces masks of despair. They had tried everything. The system was lost. Colonel Madsen stared at the screen, defeated. "The Zero Protocol is a myth," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. "A ghost story they tell cadets at the academy. There is no code." He looked at Anya, a final, desperate appeal in his eyes. "Is there?" Anya turned her head slowly, finally meeting his gaze. For the first time, there was something other than neutrality in her expression. It was a flicker of the immense weight she had carried in her silence for years. "The code exists, sir," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with absolute authority. She pushed away from the tactical screen and walked towards the main command console, the one Davies had abandoned. The other soldiers parted before her, a silent, instinctive recognition of a higher power at play. She sat down in the chair. Her posture was perfect, her back straight. She placed her fingers on the keyboard, holding them there for a beat, the only still point in a room vibrating with terror. The countdown showed 2 minutes. "It can't be accessed through the standard interface," she said, her fingers beginning to move. She wasn't typing commands. She was typing code, lines of it appearing in a new, raw command line window she had opened with a string of keystrokes no one recognized. "You have to speak to the machine in its native language." The screen flickered, the normal user interface dissolving into a cascade of pure data. She was bypassing layers of the operating system, burrowing down to the machine's primordial core. "What are you doing?" Davies breathed, watching over her shoulder in disbelief. "Opening a direct channel to the firmware kernel," she replied without pausing. "It's the only part of the system the Cerberus worm can't touch." 1 minute left. The low thrum of the turret motors could be felt through the floor. Madsen held his breath. Anya's fingers flew across the keyboard, a blur of motion. She was not just recalling a sequence. She was having a conversation with the deep architecture of the base, a system she knew as well as her own name. The protocol was designed as a final resort, to be used only in the event of total system compromise by a creator-level threat. She continued, her voice a calm, steady narrative against the backdrop of impending doom. It was encrypted with a key that couldn't be broken because it was never stored on any network. It was memorized, entrusted to a single operator. 30 seconds. A prompt appeared on the screen, stark and simple against the black background. Initiate zero protocol? Y/N. Authorization required, this was it. The final gate. Anya paused. She took a slow, deliberate breath. Then, she began to type the code. It was a long, complex string of letters, numbers, and symbols, a sequence of over 64 characters. She typed it from memory, flawlessly, her rhythm unbroken. As the final character was entered, she pressed enter for a fraction of a second. Before the entire system went dark, a single line of confirmation text flashed on the screen in bright green letters. Authorization accepted. NYX. Davies saw it. His eyes went wide, and a choked gasp escaped his lips. Nix, he whispered, the name spoken with the reverence a historian might use for a legendary king. It can't be. Colonel Madsen froze. The name resonated in the deepest recesses of his military knowledge. Nix wasn't a person. It was a ghost, a myth from the dawn of the military's cyber warfare division. Nix was the codename for the legendary programmer who had single-handedly designed the security architecture for the entire first generation of automated defense grids. An operator so skilled, so secretive, their existence was officially denied. They said Nix could walk through any firewall, break any encryption, and build systems that were decades ahead of their time. And he had assigned this legend to log inventory. The screen went black. The countdown vanished. The menacing hum of the turrets ceased. The alarms fell silent. Every light in the base, every server, every system went dead. They were plunged into absolute darkness and a silence so profound it was like the end of the world. Then, after 10 seconds of terrifying stillness, the dim red glow of the emergency backup lights flickered on, casting long, dancing shadows across the comms hub. The crisis was over. Nix had pulled the plug. In the eerie red twilight of the emergency lighting, the comms hub was a place of suspended time. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and the silent, collective shock of 24 soldiers who had just been pulled back from the brink of oblivion. No one spoke. No one moved. All eyes were on the woman sitting at the main console, her silhouette framed by the dead screens. Anya Volkov, Master Sergeant. Nix. The two identities seemed impossible to reconcile, yet the proof was in the profound silence of a base that had, seconds ago, been screaming its own death warrant. The system began its reboot sequence. A single, pure line of text appeared on the main screen. Kernel reboot in progress. Secure Core verified the ghost was gone, purged by the digital firestorm its own creator had unleashed. Colonel Madsen felt as though the floor had dropped out from under him. He had built his career on order, protocol, and the clear lines of the chain of command. He judged his soldiers by their files, by their stated qualifications, by the neat and tidy boxes the system put them in. And the system had failed him. It had sent him a living legend disguised as a piece of administrative chaff, and he had been too blind, too arrogant to see it. He walked slowly across the room, his boots echoing in the stillness. He stopped beside her chair. Anya hadn't moved. She was looking at the rebooting screen, her face impassive in the red glow. He looked at her, then at the clean, uncorrupted code scrolling on the monitor, and then back at her. The chasm of his ignorance was laid bare before him. He had mocked her silence, mistaking it for emptiness, when all along it had been the quiet of profound, unimaginable competence. There were no words, no apologies, that could adequately bridge that gap. There was only one thing protocol offered that could even begin to express the depth of his realignment. He straightened his uniform, pulling at the tunic. He drew himself up to his full height, not as a commander asserting authority, but as a soldier acknowledging a superior. He raised his right hand in a slow, sharp, perfect salute. "Master Sergeant," he said. His voice raw with an emotion she had never heard from him before. It was respect, absolute and unconditional. Anya turned her head, her gaze meeting his. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. Seeing their commander, the other soldiers in the room, one by one, began to follow suit. Sergeant Reyes, a grim smile touching his lips, was the first. His salute was crisp, a veteran's acknowledgement of a fellow professional. Corporal Davies, still trembling slightly, brought his hand up, his eyes wide with an awe usually reserved for deities. Soon, the entire room was at attention, a silent, red-lit forest of salutes, all directed at the quiet woman who had just saved them. It was a tribute more powerful than any medal, a spontaneous and unanimous declaration of respect that transcended rank and regulation. It was an apology for their whispers, their mockery, their blindness. They were saluting not just the Master Sergeant, but the ghost who walked among them. Hours later, the base was stirring back to life. Full power had been restored, systems were being methodically checked, and a sense of weary relief had settled over the crew. The storm outside had finally broken, and the first rays of a weak, Arctic sun were painting the ice fields in shades of pale gold. Anya stood alone in the observation dome, a curved space of reinforced glass that offered a panoramic view of the desolate landscape. She held a steaming mug of coffee in her hands, its warmth a small comfort against the vast cold on the other side of the glass. She watched the light crawl across the horizon, her thoughts as quiet and empty as the tundra before her. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind the familiar, placid calm that was her natural state. The hiss of the door opening behind her didn't make her turn. She knew the footsteps. Colonel Madsen came to stand beside her, holding a mug of his own. They stood in silence for a long time, watching the sunrise. "Central Command responded to my request," Madsen said finally, his voice low, conversational. "They confirmed it. Your file is mostly a work of fiction. The real one is extensive." He took a sip of his coffee. "They want you back. Said you were on extended sabbatical, and that your little vacation is over. A transport is being prepped." Anya didn't respond. Her gaze remained fixed on the horizon. "I also got a message from General Peterson himself," Madsen continued. "He asked me to convey his personal gratitude, and to ask you what you wanted. Any post, any command. Your choice." He looked at her profile, at the stoic, unreadable lines of her face. "After what you did, you can write your own ticket. You don't have to hide out in places like this anymore." Anya took a slow sip from her mug. She considered his words, the future they offered, a future of command, of recognition, of no longer having to wear the cloak of obscurity. She thought about the noise, the politics, the endless meetings that came with such a life. Then she looked out at the silent, empty, beautiful wasteland. She found a strange peace in its isolation. Here, the mission was clear, the variables were quantifiable, and the silence was a comfort, not a punishment. "This post is fine, sir," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Madsen looked at her, surprised. "Here? After all that, you want to stay here?" "It's quiet," Anya said simply. It was the only explanation she needed to give. He studied her for a moment longer, then a slow understanding dawned on his face. She wasn't hiding from the world. She was choosing her piece of it. She didn't need the world's acclaim. The quiet dignity of a job well done was enough. "All right, Sergeant," he said, a newfound respect softening the edges of his voice. "As you were." He finished his coffee and left her alone with her thoughts. Anya turned back to the window, looking at her faint reflection in the glass. For a moment, she saw the ghost staring back. Nix, the legendary operator, the architect of digital wars. But it was just a flicker. The image resolved back into the face of Master Sergeant Anya Volkov, a quiet woman in a quiet place, her silence no longer a subject of mockery, but a symbol of strength. The respect she had earned was as vast and as silent as the Arctic landscape stretching out before her, and it was all she had ever truly wanted.